The Sload, also known as slugmen, are an amphibious slug-like bestial race indigenous to the islands of Thras in the Abecean Sea. Renowned for their expertise in the arts of necromancy, they are debatably the most resented race among the residents of Tamriel. The Sload are believed to have resided on Thras since the earliest eras of Nirn, but other sources signify that they also previously resided in Tamriel, more explicitly in the Somerset Isles. It is understood that the most ancient ruins of Somerset were colossal coral constructs apparently designed by the Sload. While some conclude this means the Sload may have considered the Isles part of their territory, it is also theorized that the Isles may have been deemed part of Thras as a whole. Ysgramor, a fabled Etmoran monarch from the Merethic era, was understood to have a pouch made for carrying wine that was made from the hide of a Sload, entailing he had some form of contact with them. Since before documented time, the Sload were told to have periodically invaded the ultimary citizens of the Isles, often summoning up terrifying sea monsters to do the labor they were physically powerless to do. The master archer of Molag Amur, André Veloth, is documented as having clashed with the Sload at Lake Nabia in Vardenfell for 9 days before his failure. Since the first Rhaegar pioneers settled in Hammerfell around the First Era 808, the Sload had taken interest of their tradition of entombing criminals on isles dotting the shores, with the corpses being utilized for necromantic procedures and miniature assaults under the heartland of Hammerfell. While the Red Guards ultimately expelled these invaders, observations of Sload residing along the shores of Hammerfell have persisted into the Third Era. One of the most infamous and ruthless onslaughts coordinated by the Sload ensued at the city of Skywatch on the northern shores of Aradon in the First Era 1301. During the onslaught, the Sload first overthrew the small island of Aranorn, the easternmost isle of the Somerset Isles, utilizing infections to their benefit. The ultimary residents of Skywatch orchestrated a dependable defense to the city, chiefly withstanding from an extensive citadel known as High Tide Keep. From the citadel, the Ultimary used impressive magical constructs to eradicate dozens of Sload fleets. The resistance held up until a Sload warcaster consumed explosive alchemical reagents and leapt off the cliff, concluding in a colossal explosion, plunging the city into the sea and granting the Sload's annexation of the city. Unfortunately for the Sload, they were unable to hold the city for very long and were promptly expelled. Nevertheless, the Sload survived on Aranorn for nearly 1,000 years, before ultimately being eliminated by a remnant of the All-Flag's navy. Aranorn became ruined, and was left deserted and dilapidated rather than reconstructed because of it being considered indefensible. The Sload-engineered Thrassian Plague is by far the most calamitous attack orchestrated by the race, and undoubtedly one of the most horrendous events in Tamrielic history. Surfacing within the western mainland as early as the First Era 2200, the pandemic was accountable for the deaths of more than half of Tamriel's populace at the time, as well as copious amounts of livestock. In the First Era 2260, the Emperor had the King of Anvil, Baron Admiral Bendu Olo, collect the greatest alliance of Tamrielic navies in history, the All-Flag's Navy, and set sail to the Isles of Thras. On the way to Thras, a mass of the ships were destroyed in a storm apparently summoned by the Sload, but it was incapable of halting the incoming armada. The All-Flag's navy appeared at the coast of Thras and annihilated the helpless defenders of the shores, along with any other Sload they encountered. While some sources allegate Thras was capsized with strong magic utilized by the All-Flag's navy, underlying sources seem to suggest that the Isles were intentionally capsized by the Sload, with the intentional destruction of their coral tower, in an attempt to stop the onslaught and wipe out a major portion of the enemy fleet. It is told that the God Ark warlock Siribane assisted Bendu Olo in his invasion of Thras, and was accountable for eradicating the pandemic that consumed Tamriel with his ring. Thras was documented to have resurfaced from the sea sometime before Tiber Septim's rule. The War of the Uvachil was another sought-out aggression of the Somerset Isles by the Sload. The war lasted from the First Era 2911 to the First Era 2917, and is recalled for the Sload's utilization of necromantic practices and demonic apparatus. The Sload sprout their lives as miniature formless non-sentient larvae that ultimately develop into fleshy amphibious octopus-resembling creatures known as pollicles during pubescence. The larva and pollicle stage that Sload assume at birth is sometimes accumulated by adult Sload and utilized in the production of a unique potent alchemical concoction known as Sload soap. It is considered by many, including the acclaimed mage Devaith Fear, that the abominable gastropods that were accountable for spreading the Thrassian Plague were in fact mutant forms of the Sload larva. The most frequently witnessed stage of the Sload is that of the adult, which appear as giant two-legged slug-like beings, known for their incredibly foul odor. More youthful adults are deficient in the ability of self-sufficiency and are commonly not observed on land, while more elder adults, due to their immense weight, are effectively stationary unless suspended in water. Sload are told to be incredibly sluggish in their movement, and have an exceedingly restricted understanding of how grasping works, inhibiting their tool use. Sload at birth are hermaphroditic until they grow old enough to jaunt upright on land, in which their reproductive organs are assimilated into their bodies. Fully grown Sload are unable to reproduce and do not hold responsibility for any of the offspring that they have created prior. For these reasons, it is commonly accepted that Sload are unable to mate with other races. While primitive studies alleged that the Sload were unable to read or write, the dreaded Sload necromancer Ngasta was later known to have written his own book, Ngasta Kvara Kvakis, in the exclusive Sload language during the Second Era. The Sload are told to be granted impeccable memory, and are able to remember everything they have ever seen or heard. Sload are said to have meticulous and studious personalities. They retain extremely powerful intellects, and are highly quick thinkers, though this natural aptitude is typically hindered by the Sload's immensely meticulous nature. Sload tend to scrupulously analyze every possible result of an action before it is attempted, resulting in an incredibly slow decision-making procedure. They are proficient of giving feedback to questions swiftly, but generally decide not to. The typical Sload is said to be very egocentric and calculating, regularly planning for their own gain and advantages, breaking decree when they trust there will be mere repercussions. Sload have a rather obvious lack of ethics, holding no concern with executing out acts of desecration, robbery, torture, abduction, homicide, genocide, or other related barbarities. Sload are incapable to genuinely present noteworthy mortal emotions beyond that of indulgence. Nevertheless, they have a profound natural ability to act out mortal emotions, allowing for illustrious expertise in politics, but typically do so in clearly misrepresented imitations, such as laughing at poor jokes, or sobbing at insignificant misfortunes. The Sload do not hold any familiarity with the concepts of dignity, companionship, or any form of adherence, only displaying a curious appreciation to those who are able to defeat or outsmart them. Ngasta, the only known Sload to speak Tamrielic, invoked to himself in third person when speaking, in a comparable method that Khajiit typically do. The culture of the Sload is broadly planted around magic, most remarkably necromancy. Every land-walking Sload understands how to utilize the recall spell as teleportation as the most effective mode of travel in Thras, because of the ingrained physical inabilities of the Sload. The natural identity of the Sload is established around desires and gluttony, causing them to earn a well-known notoriety as exceptional merchants and smugglers. The Sload frown upon carelessness, and observe mindfulness as a trait of the greatest worth. All known champions in Sload myth spend their time contemplating for years on end until they ultimately act, in which they always triumph. Villains, contrarily, are always quick-thinking, reckless, and doomed to be unsuccessful. The Sload are so unyielding in this manner that in their language, the best interpretation for the word adventure translates to tragic disaster. Very little information is known about any structure of societal leadership amongst the Sload, but one rare text momentarily speaks of an enlarged eldritch fleshy mass with a throbbing head and 3 eyes upon its stomach, invoked to as the Elder Distended One. Why the Sload are so antagonistic to other races is not entirely understood by the scholars of Tamriel. The only known race the Sload have ever had any conciliatory communication with was the Maormer, because of their shared resentment against all other races. Regardless, there are more documented accounts of rivalry between the two races than confederacy. The Sload are infamous for their adroitness in the necromantic arts, often being asserted as Tamriel's most eminent necromancers. Sload have allegedly used airships to haul copious amounts of cadavers from Stenshall to Thras, and that an uncannily large number of slaves are bought by Sload merchants in Tyr, whom are inevitably murdered and resuscitated as thralls. While Sload have never been witnessed to carry out necromantic procedures on their own kind in Tamriel, it would not be beyond assumption that they likely do so in Thras. It is true that Sload use copious amounts of their own larvae in necromantic practices, and have on Thras been known to resuscitate assorted dead sea creatures such as crabs and turtles as pets of some sort. Possibly the most distinguished Sload relative to Tamrielic documents, Ngasta, found himself in the employment of the King of Worms, who gave him an island adjacent to Stros Makai, where he could carry out his necromantic practices and Daedric business. It is suggested that this type of colonizing was almost routine for Sload, setting up laboratories on old Redguard sepulchres built off the shores of the mainland. While pillaging other lands, Sload almost always used necromancy to their benefit, infamous for summoning colossal sea beasts along seaside domains. While the Sload are typically stated to not worship any deities, some hypothesize, based on their bizarre rituals, that they do practice some fashion of religion, be it ancestor devotion, conservancy of ancient magic, or some unknown entirely unfamiliar pantheon. The Sload are known to carry out ceremonial sacrifices to the Daedric princes, but they seem to be contacted from an exclusively business angle, rather than a religious standpoint. More heretical Sload customs tell of them devoting years of educating particular individuals to imitate astonishingly long scenes from Sload fables, which end with each of the performers being executed by the voluntary consumption of desiccation crystals. The Sload, as a race, have a bizarre, unheard-of appreciation for the King of Worms, undoubtedly because of his expertise with necromancy, and had made some form of treaty with their race. Many Sload recognized him to be a champion to their race. It is even said that upon his ascension to godhood, that some Sload voluntarily communed with him. Sea Sloads are a subspecies of the Sload race that inhabit the sunken domain of Ulvorkus. It is told that before the ancient elves of Aldamaris landed in the Somerset Isles, the Sload used to occupy the territory. A beverage known as Thrassian chai was occasionally sold by refreshment salesmen during the Second Era, though whether or not this drink was a true creation of the Sload cannot be said with validity. They were also understood to have specifically bred the tangerine dragon frog so that they could perceive it more efficiently on Thras, and while some professors state that the Sload kept them as pets, the Sload word for them transcribes to snack, suggesting they consume them as a delicacy. Sload architecture is instantly discernible because of the use of coral as their main construction material. Within the large salty lagoon of the gulf that makes up Thras, there lies a colossal web of coral structures and historical shipwrecks, which the Sload supposedly use for quick transportation amongst the islands. Along this grid lies a myriad of sunken towers. The floors of every land-based construction on Thras is told to be coated with multiple inches of mucus and algae-glazed water. Certain texts speak of two gargantuan coral towers built by the Sload within Thras. The coral tower was an especially giant, blood-red coral structure built upon an island of Thras. The tower was expressed to have reached into the sky and had been capped with a large flickering blue light. During the raid of Thras by the All-Flags Navy, the light was said to throb and weep power, making the island burst and submerge into the sea, along with disintegrating the tower. The tower's cataclysm spawned a tremendous sea vortex that swallowed a considerable fraction of the enemy fleet. It has been hypothesized that this construction may have in fact been one of the towers, the structures dotting Tamriel that protect Nirn from the forces of Oblivion. The Pillar of Thras was a 1,000-foot-tall corkscrew coral structure used chiefly by the Sload for ceremonial sacrifice. Its position, looking over an extensive continuous ocean vortex known as the Maelstrom of Baal, has led many to suppose that it is, itself, a remodeling of the coral tower. Sload are often carried to the pinnacle of the tower and thrown into the vortex, where they either perish from the ocean and rocks below or dematerialize into oblivion.